Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for the second year in a row inviting me to be part of this incredible committee that brings these terrific leaders together for an exciting afternoon, I think, of real inspiration. When you think about public service and people who dedicate their life to public service, you really have to think about the definition of idealism. And I think one definition of idealism is someone who passionately commits themselves to the idea that one person with energy, enthusiasm, and intelligence can actually make a difference. You then have to think about the definition of a cynic, which is said to be an idealist who has been disappointed. And then you think about Martha Coakley, and you see someone who has the real passion to maintain her idealism in the face of disappointment, and I think that is the definition of courage. Martha was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. She graduated with honors from Williams College and then went to law school at BU. And I was talking to her and asked her, what really set you on this path of idealism and public service? And she said, well, I was born into a family of 5. And when you're in a situation like that in the middle class, you learn fairness very quickly. And I sort of kept pushing her, and she said, I realized that as a woman, if I was going to make my mark, I had to do it on my own and on my own terms. And she thought law was going to be a great place to do that. And as a trial lawyer, she told me that she found that there was a real power in getting in front of people and advocating and using law to move things forward. And as I reflected on my studies of the women's movement in college, there were 2 metaphors that kept being used over and over again. One was building bridges, how women leaders have to build the bridges for the generation behind them. And the other is the often used glass ceiling. I think Martha Coakley has put bricks in those bridges, and she has put cracks in those ceilings. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you the Attorney General of Massachusetts, Martha Coakley.
Girls, we run this mother. Yeah. Girls, we run this mother. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. I can tell you I'm happy that I'm on before the robot. I'm not talking about Dr. Carl. I love Dr. Carl. The robot is out behind, and you are in for a treat. So I'm just delighted to be here with you. And it's exciting to have all of you here for today. You've got an incredible array of things you're doing, from robots to Scandal, from Big Sister, which I heartily applaud, by the way, is a terrific, terrific enterprise. I know you're going to hear from Corinne later, and I have a lot of admiration for her and the work she's done for Perkins. And so I'm jealous that I can't spend the afternoon here, but I do have a little bit of time with you. And I'm delighted that you are here with each other this afternoon to pay attention to yourselves about what you do and what you do with each other. This is Women's History Month, and last night I had an opportunity to honor women up in Peabody. The Chamber of Commerce has its Women's Evening. They give out the Mary Upton Ferrin Award, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And tonight I'm actually talking to women in real estate, another sort of women's history, let's talk about where we are, where we need to go event. And I think it's really important that we have recognition in the present for women who are working hard, who are doing what they want, what they care about, what they love. But it's also important that we do this for our future. And as we do it, we don't forget what's happened in the past, because as you celebrate your 100th anniversary, it means that this organization was founded just a few years after women got the right to vote. And tonight, I'm going to be speaking to the women in real estate at the Union Club. It was founded 150 years ago, a time of Civil War. It was actually the efforts of those in Massachusetts, and particularly in Boston, who wanted to fight the slavery issue. Of course, for a long time, women could not go into the Union Club. And I remember when I first became an attorney in Boston, you could not be a member of the Union Club. This was not, of course, 150 years ago when I became an attorney in Boston, which says it was the 20th century, and we have come away since then. You can now go to the Union Club and be a member, and we're clearly in a much better place than we were 100 years ago, 150 years ago. even 20 years ago. But I think when we look at the history and how far we've come, I think it's also important to remember what else we need to do. And so in thinking about talking with you all today, I also started to think a little bit about women that I admire, and as a history buff, and as somebody who thinks that our history is important, I did a little bit of research, particularly because I had never heard of Mary Upton Ferrin, who is a Massachusetts native. I can't really see anybody, but is there anybody in the audience who knows who Mary Upton Ferrin is? I don't see any hands. Okay, so you're with me. I didn't know either. What I did want to just say is that whenever I talk about women and women working together and where we've come, I always ask people, not because I'm concerned about how old they are, but it's important to know what year they were born, when did they graduate from college, because the ways in which our opinions of our progress and ourselves is shaped, I think, also depends on what our own experience was. And that is what is so important about understanding what our experience was growing up, what influenced us as we were growing up, and what about that was good, what helps us be successful because of that experience, and what about it is stuff we should re-look at, that we should re-examine. And I think women who graduated from college in the 90s are very different from my group. 1975, we were in the first class of women to go through Williams College, an all-male school in a remote part of Berkshire County. That experience was very different. And yet, Dr. Carl just talked about building those bridges. It is important that we maintain those bridges with each generation, not only behind us, but those who went before us, because their experiences about what it was like to grow up, go to school, stay home, have children, is incredibly important for us to understand what our history is. And of course, history, his story, is different from her story, often written by men, usually written by men, and it's incredibly important that we know our own stories in order to build on them and to change lack of equality, to change what's happened in the past, and to keep the good, to remember how brave and courageous so many women have been all through history. A good example, a great book by Stacy Schiff called Cleopatra. Again, I can't see your hands, so I'm going to ask for a voice vote. How many of you read Cleopatra? Yes? Yes? Clap if you've read it. Okay, more of you should read it then. You didn't know you were going to get homework from today. Stacy Schiff actually grew up in Adams, Massachusetts, right next to where I grew up in North Adams, and she wrote a terrific book about Cleopatra, who, if you follow Hollywood and Elizabeth Taylor and other historians at the time, she's portrayed pretty much as a best supporting actress for what those great Romans were doing. But if you read the book, you understand that she was an incredibly important political and military force in Egypt at the time. Now, the Egyptians ended up losing, and so there is a reason probably that Herodotus and other historians paint her differently. I highly recommend the book to you because it will give you an idea about what a difference it makes when women write about women and their experience and the lens through which they look at that and how it changes that perspective. So in thinking about Cleopatra, for instance, and about women taking their place in the boardrooms, in elected office. One of my favorite bumper stickers is "Well-behaved women seldom make history." And it's been an important lesson for all of us, I think, to think about. I went to Catholic school growing up. You know, I was a great student. Sister, raise your hand. But that is not always what gets you ahead in the world, right? Being polite and waiting for others. I think we're going to celebrate shortly in 2020 the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And we should always understand how difficult that battle was. It's not that long ago that women fought by going on hunger strikes, being arrested. If you have not seen the HBO production of Iron-Jawed Angels, I recommend it. It's tough to watch, but you should watch it with your daughters, with your sisters, with your aunts, your mother, if you still have you're lucky enough to have your moms. It's a very important piece of history about how women were willing to organize and march on the White House to say, We want the same rights that men have, property rights, rights to vote. And it will open your eyes, I think, even if you think you know a little bit about women's suffrage history. But we have come a long way. Look, we're terrifically lucky to have Senator Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts now serving in Washington. She is fabulous. She is great. And she is and will be a terrific senator, so I'm really delighted that she was successful in that race. We have one congresswoman now, Nikki Tsongas, who also is terrific. We need more congresswomen, so keep that in mind. Your Senate President, Terry Murray, is a tough champion for your budget and for women in Massachusetts. Our auditor, Suzanne Bump, first female auditor in Massachusetts. Until recently, our Chief Judge in the Supreme Judicial Court, Margaret Marshall, was very good at wielding the authority that she needed to run that court. And until recently, our Chief Colonel of the State Police was a woman, Marion McGovern. We've got terrific mayors in Massachusetts who are women, state senators, and state representatives, but it's not enough. We need more. I'm proud to serve as your Attorney General, and before that, the Middlesex District Attorney. But I think when we take a look at how far we've come, we still need to remember we need to do more. We still make less money per capita than men. We're still underrepresented in elective office, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country, and certainly on corporate boards. And we all know where some of the clout is wielded. Women are still largely the victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. We are the victims of human trafficking, by and large. All issues about which I care, and I think have come about because we still have a lot to change about attitudes of women who used to be treated as property of their fathers or then their husbands, and not now, but some of those vestiges of opinion still remain. And so I'm in the middle of reading Sheryl Sandberg's new book, Lean In. How many of you have read it? Clap. Yes. All right. If you haven't, you have to. I think I'm going to have a chance to see her because she's doing a presentation in Maryland shortly. But she's much younger than I am, and perhaps if some of you in the room are more your contemporary. And I think some of the early reviews, even though I haven't finished the book, I feel free to give a review. I think some of the early reviews weren't necessarily fair because she's very honest about her experience growing up and in looking back on how she was able to be successful and what she's learned from that by saying to other women, we are not going to change the world if we sit waiting to be asked. We're not going to be promoted, we're not going to be given the job if we are simply well-behaved, no matter how smart we are. And I think it's important advice to remember, because it is about making sure you, like the Marines say, can be all that you can be. So whether you're in business or not-for-profit or government, and I know a lot of you are in industry today, we stand on the shoulders of women who made sacrifices. And that's our mothers and our grandmothers, our aunts, our siblings. And certainly Massachusetts has a very rich history of strong and brave women who've blazed that path for equality. So I wanted to mention just a few today as we are talking about women we admire. First of all, you cannot ignore Abigail Adams. She was the wife of our revolutionary hero, second President John Adams. He actually was very dependent upon her. I think she probably had more common sense than he did in some ways, and she was a very tough character. Because they spent so much time separated while he was in Philadelphia or he was serving overseas, they actually engaged. They did not have email then. They engaged in a lot of long correspondence. And it's interesting to read from those letters, his and hers, the strength of that partnership they had while she ran the farm and carried the books while he was fighting for the country. She was one of the earliest voices in America for equality and women's rights. And we see that both in his response to her and her letters. And one of her quotes, which you've probably heard along the way, goes like this. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Sounds familiar, right? Because that's the very argument her husband was making to the British about no taxation without representation. Now, one of my favorite musicals is 1776. The text of some of those letters between John and Abigail were put to music. It's Broadway style. I'm not going to sing it, I promise. But John is urging Abigail to get the ladies together to send saltpeter down for the early muskets they need. They can't fire them without saltpeter. But she responds, because she's worried about her own concerns up in Massachusetts. She says, "I've gone from Framingham to Boston, and I cannot find a pin." "Don't you know there's a war on?" says the tradesman with a grin. "Well, I will not make saltpeter until you send us pins." We could all use Abigail in some of our negotiations these days, I think. She knew how to take a stand, what was important, and she's an incredible role model for all of us. So now I get to Mary Upton Ferren, who grew up in West Peabody in the 19th century. I had never heard of her either, but she, just in 1848, just as Seneca was really deemed to be the home of the women's suffrage movement, 1848, the great meeting at Seneca Falls, Mary Upton Ferren started her own process in Massachusetts, traveled all over the state until she wore out her shoes, her feet were bloody, getting signatures for a petition to change the laws. And the reason it came about is that at 35, she was married to a 31-year-old who was an alcoholic, abusive husband. She went to see an attorney who basically said, "Forget it, Mary, you don't have any rights, you don't have any property, there's no rights under the law and you're not going to be able to change them." That just made her more determined to try and get support, and she had support from women and some men over the colony, over Massachusetts, to start petitions to change the law in Massachusetts just about basic rights for women. But then the Civil War came along, and there was resistance to trying to do too much reform at the same time, and the focus was really on getting rid of slavery. And some of the reformers on women's rights and on those issues did get pitted against each other. In the next generation, and I do recommend the HBO Iron-Jawed Angels if you haven't seen it. It features Alice Paul, who organized the first pickets ever at the White House in 1914 and 15, and along with dozens of other women who marched. You know the suffragette banners, you've seen pictures of them, both in England and in the United States. They were arrested on civil disobedience, they went on hunger strikes, and they were brutally force-fed. The picture displays that, and thus the title, Iron-Jawed Angels. So where does that bring us now? Women fought, marched, organized, worked really hard to make sure that I could be a member of the bar. There was a time when women were not permitted in the professions because we were too delicate, or whatever the reasons were, we couldn't do it. We all know how we had to fight to overcome those prejudices. I know when I first came out of law school in the early 80s, it was really important for me to work with other women through our Women's Bar Association. We were trying to be trial lawyers at a time when it was still a man's business. There were very few women on the bench, and you really had to push your way to the front of the line to be taken seriously, but we did it with each other. We filed amicus briefs about gender discrimination. We used our advocacy tools to say, we don't want to be better than anybody else, we just want to be treated fairly. And I still have friendships and relationships from that time that were really important. Even today, I really look forward to once a year the dinners that I have with other female attorneys general, although we have over 50 in the country, we only have 9. Women attorneys general, and we meet with the prior women attorneys general about our history and about our future, which inspires us. And that kind of relationship, and I know you find that, I'm sure, at work and in this organization, is really important. It means that we want to be paid for the same amount for doing the same job, that we get an equal shot at leadership, that are the places that opinions and decisions get made. How do we spend our budget? How the really important decisions about our priorities get made sometimes where women are not, and we need to make sure we are there. Because we do care about our families and our personal needs as well as our success. And it is a personal commitment for all of you, I think, to say we are going to work with each other and with younger women to make sure that we share those stories and that camaraderie, that we're honest with each other, but that we help each other. And I said earlier when I was talking to Dr. Carl about the glass ceiling, I said, you know, sometimes I think there's a glass ladder too. you can climb up it just so far and then someone knocks it out from under you. We have to do that for each other. We have to work with each other, not compete with each other, but work with each other to make sure that we can crack that ceiling as well as move up that ladder. So, as Attorney General, I get to do some great stuff. And one of the things that is most important to me right now is making sure I keep people in their homes, that I avoid by pushing the banks to make sure that we don't have unnecessary foreclosures. It's interesting, as we fought in this, some of the big voices, the lead voices on fairness in this settlement were my colleagues like Kamala Harris in California, Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada, women attorneys general who said, this is not just about a settlement, this is about getting a fair settlement, and as much as we can, and we are going to make sure that we avoid unnecessary foreclosures. We still do that in Massachusetts, family by family, to make sure that banks who find it easier to file a foreclosure don't do that if it makes commercial sense to keep people in their homes. Another thing I'm really proud of is working on passing and implementing our new anti-human trafficking statute. Most, although not all, of victims of human trafficking are women and girls in this country and around the world. It's unacceptable that in 2013, young people are sold for sex or labor right here in Massachusetts. It happens. We don't see it. They are runaways. They are from other states. As the police will tell you, they are now in hotel rooms because Craigslist and the internet make it easy, so they don't even see these young people on the streets. And organizations like Big Sister are incredibly important to make sure that every young girl in Boston, in Massachusetts, has the chance at opportunity, success, and a safe life. And so those are the kinds of things that drive me in terms of what I do as Attorney General. I want to leave you with just two thoughts from two more of my heroines before I leave you. Beryl Markham, who was an early solo pilot, she was featured in the movie Out of Africa, and she was the author of a book called West with the Night. There were a lot of folks who figured that she was not really the author of that book because, of course, women couldn't really write that well, but I think that's been disputed. But I keep this on my refrigerator at home. If a man has any greatness in him, it comes to light, not in one flamboyant hour, but in the ledger of his daily work. And I also want to leave you with a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. Women are like tea bags. You only know their strength when they're in hot water. So let's make a resolution today, individually with each other, as we all are working to find success and happiness in our professional and personal lives. Let's get out there and misbehave a little bit. Get into some hot water. Lean in, as Sheryl Sandberg would say, and let's show our greatness in the ledger of our daily work. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.